The Delaware Indian word Wyoming means a land that moves constantly between mountains and valleys. But the wind has always ruled Wyoming. It has been said that it drove some of the first white settlers mad. And yet it was this same wind and the promise of a new life that brought those who came and stayed. There too were stories of those whose lives were but a passing breeze in a wind-filled land. Jonita Bonham only lived in Wyoming for 6 weeks, the last 6 weeks of her 72 years, and yet almost no one in this state knew that she was an Army and an Air Force veteran and a national hero. Jonita was born and raised in Oklahoma City in 1922. After graduating from nursing school some 20 years later, she joined what was then called the Army Air Corps and was commissioned a second lieutenant in the Medical Corps during World War II. Jonita served in the Philippines and Japan just after the war. She returned to the United States and resigned from the military until the start of the Korean War, and without hesitation rejoined what is now called the United States Air Force as a first lieutenant. Soon after, she volunteered as a flight nurse in the Medical Air Evacuation Program. Their aircraft was a C-54 cargo plane. It had been converted into a miniature hospital emergency room. They would leave Japan with replacement combat troops and fly them to Kimpo, Korea, and then bring back and care for the wounded headed for the military hospitals in Japan. Their aircraft was constantly under enemy fire by North Korean troops on takeoffs and landings. At one point, Jonita and her crew had been aloft for 245 hours and had evacuated over 600 wounded from Korea. There were no days off and very little sleep. There were token 3-hour naps between flights. The early morning hours of September 26, 1950, Lieutenant Jonita Bonham woke up from her 3-hour nap. She heated up and drank 2 strong cups of black coffee. After this brief respite, Bonham headed for the flight operations. Once inside the operations building, Bonham met with Lieutenant Vera Brown. She and a medical technician were the only 2 members of her team. Outside, Bonham and Brown could see hundreds of soldiers waiting to board the other cargo planes. Their normal routine was about to become anything but normal. Once Bonham and Brown had boarded their plane, the pilot told them to try to get some sleep. But neither was ready. They sat next to each other and talked as the big engines of the C-54 began to roar as they moved down the runway. The plane slowly began to climb into the air as it left the runway, and it went up over the shores of the Sea of Japan. When the plane was about a half a mile from shore, it suddenly stalled and dropped from the sky. The C-54 slammed into the Sea of Japan. The impact made an awful noise, and the whole aircraft began to submerge all at once. The force of the crash caused the huge cargo plane to break into 3 pieces. Jonita Bonham found herself completely underwater and fought with all of her strength to reach the surface. Once she made it and grasped her first breath of air, Jonita, in total darkness, listened as water began to swallow up the cargo plane. Desperately, she fought to keep herself above the water, to escape the confines of what was left of the aircraft. What made things worse was that the wind had whipped the sea into a churning mass of water. Kicking her legs with all of her might to stay afloat, Bonham was finally able to grab onto a floating barracks bag that came near her. Some of the men around her were swimming, while others floated in the water, terribly still. For the first half minute, everything around her was quiet. A voice out of the dark soon brought Jonita back to the world of sound. "There's a life raft here," the man shouted. "How do you inflate it?" And Jonita yelled back, Yank it out of the case and it will inflate itself. Then she took command of the situation. The pilot and the co-pilot were both dead. Vera Brown had vanished. The next moment, Bonham saw a silhouette of a raft bouncing high on a wave. She let go of the barracks bag and began to swim towards the raft, as did about a half-dozen men. One of the men close by saw Jonita and screamed to the other, "Hey, it's one of the nurses!" She felt an arm pushing her towards the raft. Once she reached the raft, she grabbed the rope that trailed from behind the raft and then chose to stay in the water. Jonita shook the water from her face and eyes and began looking for others who were still in the water. She could see the surface of the water spotted with heads of the swimming men. Bonham then reached out to the closest man and grabbed him and guided his fingers towards the life rope. Then she found another, then another, until she had 17 men with her. All were able to get into the raft except Jonita. In the darkness, she could make out another life raft about 20 yards away and saw men getting into it. Once Jonita was sure that everyone who had survived was on a life raft, she allowed some of the men to reach down into the cold, churning waters and drag her up over the side. Once she lay in the crowded raft, the pain hit her like a large hammer. Her head and chest throbbed as a wave of nausea hit her. Bonita's left arm hurt, and as she held it up, she could see that her wrist was bent to one side. She knew it was broken, but she didn't have time to worry about it. She was responsible for the lives of the survivors on the two rafts, and she didn't know how long it would be before help arrived. One man in the raft panicked and shouted he was going to swim for it, but Bonham commanded him to stay in the raft. "This water is full of sharks. Besides, you'll be blown out to sea in this weather. Take it easy, soldier. Rescue boats will be here in a minute." Ironically, no one at base operations knew the C-54 had crashed. As the lifeboats floated, Bonham and the others could see other planes taking off from the airstrip, but none of the planes could see through the darkness to the Sea of Japan's surface. Many of the 17 men with her were seriously injured. In rough seas and with water pouring into the two rafts, it was impossible for Bonham to give first aid. What she could do, though, was comfort them and keep the other survivors busy by shouting orders to them. Forgetting her own injuries, she talked panicked men out of jumping into the water and kept encouraging them to stay calm until her throat was raw.
One of her concerns with all these guys in the water, was their safety, and they were panicking. And she was essentially still in command of the situation, and with her nurses training and just who my mother was. My mother was not an easily panicked woman. She was hurt, she was injured, she knew things were bad, but her concern was to get the men calmed down because they were talking about trying to jump the raft and swim and stuff like that, and a lot of them were injured. So there was no way that she wanted them to do that. So part of what she was doing was trying to control their emotions, help them calm down, and then at the same time, when they had the opportunity to try and attract the attention of the shore, to give them something positive to be doing, to be yelling and screaming in a positive way.
"Stay where you are, you'll capsize us. Here, pass this line to them. Show them the other raft. Have them tow us ashore. Have them tow both rafts." Once she saw both rafts were secured to the fishing boats, she felt a jerk of the lines. Bonham was able to relax a little. Everything went dim, but she was not unconscious. The last thing she remembered was reaching shore. The next thing she saw was the inside of a hospital, and that's all she would see for the next 9 months. Jonita Bonham's injuries were very extensive, including a broken cheekbone, a major skull fracture. Her right arm was broken at the shoulder. Her left wrist was broken. She was eventually transferred to the Maxwell Air Force Base Hospital in Alabama. One day after she had undergone her third head surgery, Jonita Bonham was notified that Lieutenant General George Stratemeyer was coming to pay a visit. This really bothered her because she didn't have any hair. It had all been shaved off because of her surgery. A friend found a nice scarf and it could be tied around her head. Jonita couldn't, for the life of her, think of why a general would want to see her. If she hadn't been so incapacitated with her shoulder and an arm cast, Jonita would have fallen out of bed when she found out the reason for his visit. General Stratemeyer presented Jonita Bonham with a Distinguished Flying Cross, the highest decoration for valor that the Air Force bestows. This made Jonita Bonham the only woman in the history of the Korean War to be the recipient of the Air Force's highest award for valor. Jonita became a national hero. Newspapers and magazines plastered their covers with her face. Every woman's magazine and the Reader's Digest both ran stories about Bonham. And then on April 9, 1952, Cavalcade of America radio program aired her story. Jonita did not like to brag about anything, particularly what she had accomplished in the Sea of Japan that night. She didn't allow the Hollywood hype to affect her demeanor. Shortly after being presented with the Distinguished Flying Cross, Jonita Bonham was promoted to captain, and she married Major Clifford Beauvais. Jonita was eventually medically discharged from the service. She raised 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. They traveled the world and eventually settled in Colorado Springs, Colorado. On December 24, 1994, Jonita Ruth Bonham Beauvais quietly passed away from an insidious killer, cancer, in the home of her daughter, Renee Beauvais, of Cheyenne, Wyoming. Her story, like all hero stories, has faded in the minds of all those except for whom she saved, and those who loved her.